a few days we'll be celebrating Independence Day. And with great fanfare, the celebration of freedom. And somebody pointed out a couple of days ago that unlike many other nations, they celebrate their founding, their Independence Day. We do not celebrate it with a big military parade. We don't have parades of tanks and of those in uniform marching down the main street. We might do that for Veterans Day or some other occasions, but Independence Day instead is a big party. We get together with family and friends, we have those cookouts, we shoot off those fireworks. And by the way, I won't have to go far for the fireworks. People in the neighborhood are really into fireworks, so I have to just step on the back porch of the rectory. This declaration of freedom from tyranny, political oppression. That's how we often understand freedom, as freedom from something, such as freedom from discrimination, freedom from injustice, inequality, freedom from slavery. We should also understand freedom as a freedom for something, such as the saying goes, the freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We should see freedom as a gift. And as with any gift, it can be used for the good or it can be used for the bad. If it's used well, freedom will only strengthen. But if it's misused, if it is abused, it weakens. I'll give you an example. If one is of legal age, one has the freedom to purchase and consume alcohol. But if that freedom is abused, one can then be enslaved by an addiction to alcohol. Another abuse of freedom we see on the cultural level, such as freedom of speech being used to defend pornography, and the so-called freedom to choose used to end the life of the unborn. Freedom does not mean free license to do what we want, when we want, wherever we want, without restraint. This is an abuse of freedom that leads to enslavement and self-destruction. And freedom does not mean that we have the godlike power to determine for ourselves what is good and what is evil, and who is worthy of life and who is worthy of death. That too is an abuse of freedom. For the purpose of freedom goes far deeper than Independence Day. God created us to be free. Father Mark Landry is a priest of the Diocese of Falls River, Massachusetts. And he was tapped a number of years ago when they had the Year of Mercy. He was one of a number of priests appointed by Pope Francis to go and to be a missionary of mercy. And I heard him speak. He actually spoke to the priest of our diocese that year. And he's a very good, dynamic preacher. And on the issue of freedom, he says, freedom is the capacity to act in accordance with the truth about who we are in God's image and likeness. It is a self-mastery that makes it possible for us to give ourselves to others in love. To act in accordance with this truth calls us to freedom for something, such as seeking a life of virtue, self-discipline, sacrifice for the greater good, and being responsible for the most vulnerable among us. And this is the freedom that Jesus challenges us with, challenges us to choose and to seek to live in today's gospel passage from Matthew. The freedom to choose God above all other things, even the bonds of family. And this is, I think, for many of us, one of those hard sayings, one of those confusing sayings of Jesus. For are we not to love, to honor our mother and father? I mean, that is in the 10 Commandments, the last time I checked. Are not husbands to love their wives the way Christ loves the church? St. Paul writes to the Ephesians, are not parents to love and sacrifice for their children. This is what we call for him the domestic church. And yes to all the above. To better understand what Jesus is talking about, Father Landry goes on to say that loving God more does not mean loving family members less. It means that by having God at the center above all else, of taking up the cross and following Jesus, we are free to love family in a more complete way. There can only be one true love, only one ultimate allegiance. If it is God, through Jesus Christ, then we have a more complete understanding of ourselves, a more complete understanding of the world around us and of our relationships. To put it another way, if we seek to love God above all things, to take up the cross, and to live as faithful disciples, we are acting in accordance with the truth of who we are in God's image and likeness. And we are freer then to give of ourselves to others. Husbands are freer to love their wives as Christ loves the church. Parents are freer to love their children and to see them as gifts from God. Children are freer to honor their mothers and fathers. And the gift of freedom is not abused. There's another freedom that Jesus speaks of today. In the context of this gospel passage, he's getting ready to send his disciples out on mission to go and tell people about the good news is here. The gospel is here. The kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of God has arrived. And he's basically telling them, now, don't be going around to these towns, one town to the next, looking for the best deal. You go to whoever's going to welcome you. Doesn't matter how good the food is or how bad the food is at the table. Doesn't matter how good or how hard the bed is or how wealthy or how poor that family is. You go to whoever is going to welcome you. And that's the freedom. The freedom to welcome the truth of the gospel and to welcome those who bring it to us. The freedom to welcome that embrace and love of God. To welcome the disciple is to welcome Jesus. To welcome Jesus is to welcome God the Father. Whoever receives me, Jesus tells the disciples, receives you, receives me. And this is prefigured in that passage from 2 Kings that we hear this morning about the husband and wife who welcome the prophet Elijah. We can use our freedom to give others the chance to welcome the truth of the gospel through us. And that includes going to others. It includes becoming a welcoming group of people, being a welcoming community, a welcoming parish, particularly at Sunday Mass. I've made it a habit of I see a new face and make a beeline if I can. And I say, are you visiting? Are you here or are you new to the parish? Or are you coming back? Get a variety of answers. But we need to be a welcoming parish, particularly on Sunday, but at other times as well. It's that gift of hospitality. St. Benedict, our patron, said, welcome everyone as if they were Christ himself. And Jesus also says, when I was a stranger, you welcomed me. To help others, to use their freedom to welcome Jesus as Lord. That is what we are called to. That's part of our mission as the church. To see, as St. Paul tells us, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so too we are to live in newness of life. But this welcoming of others cannot be superficial, because we're called to help people to use their freedom to welcome Christ. Means welcoming that call to conversion, that invitation to holiness, of being transformed by God's mercy, compassion, and love, forgiveness in Jesus Christ, and to love God above all things. And that can take some time. That can take a lot of patience. A word that we hear often today is affirmation. meaning to affirm or to give approval. And affirmation has its place. And certainly we hear Jesus is affirming those who are going to welcome his disciples, to use their freedom to welcome the gospel. And Jesus himself repeatedly goes to those who have abused their freedom, causing scandal as he does. Jesus, don't you know, you're not supposed to go over there with those people. Jesus, you're not supposed to have dinner with that kind of person. But Jesus goes to those who abuse their freedom, who've been enslaved by it. Think of all those tax collectors and prostitutes. But notice he doesn't go to give his approval, but rather to reveal the truth of God's love for them, of God's mercy, calling them to conversion. He does so to invite people to use their freedom for that conversion and to act in accordance with the truth of who they are in God's image and likeness. With Matthew, Jesus does not affirm his life as a public sinner, as a tax collector. Jesus instead says, "Follow me." And Matthew uses his freedom to become an apostle. With the woman caught in adultery, Jesus does not approve or excuse her sin. He simply says, "Go and sin no more." He calls her to freedom. With the Pharisees, the scribes, and the temple priest who are opposing Jesus at every opportunity, Jesus does not affirm their self-righteousness. He does not affirm their abuse of their freedom and their spiritual blindness. Instead, he challenges them, often in blunt terms, to be free, to use their freedom to welcome the truth of the gospel and to live in that new freedom. Jesus wants to strengthen us to choose him as he has first chosen us in love. He takes up the cross for us, dies for us, so that we may live in true freedom. He gives his divine life for us today in the sacrament of the altar. He invites us to use our God-given freedom to welcome him into our lives. We're to welcome others so that they may do the same. And in doing so, we act in accordance with the truth about who we are in God's image and likeness. And we are truly free.